I had a thought for my millennial friends, and I think it's been rolling around in my mind for a while, but it came to me again when today we had a group of students in Washington, D.C. They were getting trained on advocacy, and the gentleman speaking brought up a bill in front of 100-some students. Taught them what meeting with a senator looks like on the Hill, and kind of things you might say, might not say. It's sort of lobbying. How do you lobby a senator? A meeting. And it was all benign stuff, And then and then they decided to introduce a bill and say, well, here's the bill we're pushing. It was an innocuous bill. It was an important one, but not controversial. It was a bill about allowing the USAID department to reallocate funds and resources to helping third world countries or poor countries develop their educational systems. It is, nothing crazy, nothing radical, nothing controversial. It struck me though that the people putting that bill together had been working, putting the bill together, been working for 10 years on it, right? So just picture this in your mind now. 10 years of this advocacy group, all the meetings on the Hill, and for years and on and off, and meeting with senators and hundreds of meetings, literally hundreds of meetings. And they finally get the bill through the House, goes through unanimous this week, and then now trying to get to the Senate. So now you know where we come in, all the students here. Going to go on the Hill and advocate for this bill. All very interesting, I guess, but what really struck me was the student response. So the students were, in fact, the guy that put the meeting on, I don't think was expecting to have to defend the bill. Not to students, to be excited you're educating young kids in poor countries. And the students could not get over the bill. Well, why this? And why are you doing that? And is America going to be too involved? And or are we going to be, pressing our way? And we're going to be throwing money? And all the students are just, up in arms. Not up in arms. Maybe that's too much. But they were critical. And this poor guy who was up to just help teach the students how to lobby found himself defending this bill to a room of 100 students. And where am I going with all this? Here's the point. That these millennial students were more taken, right, with their own moral certainties than they were with the incredible labor that this group, this lobbying group, had done to get this bill through the House and now have it almost ready to go be introduced in the Senate. I was struck, I'm not a millennial, I'm a Gen Xer. I was struck by the amount of work going on. I see this huge, massive process of years and years and labor and meetings, and finally they're this close to the end, right? They're going to introduce the bill to the Senate. Hopefully it's going to go through, and this huge celebration they've done. Well, what is the millennial obsessed with? Well, the millennial is obsessed with the moral value, with I don't think I would, and why would you? And one student finally says, I don't in good conscience want to lobby for this bill. And I thought, you're 19 years old. What do you know? And I'm not saying students should have an opinion. What I'm saying is, why do young people think that their moral sensibility, use the word you prefer, is the most important thing that happens in any conversation or any event? How I feel about it, my sensitivities, why I think it should happen. And I was ruminating over this as I was listening to the students just, struggling over this bill, that I guess what really bothers me about millennials oft times, and I'm not castigating all millennials, I don't know how many think this way, but it seems to be fairly consistent, is that millennials can think very clearly in moral terms, and that's a great advantage. I mean, certainly years past have muddied moral waters, and I don't mean a certain morality, I just mean they think in moral terms, i.e. this is right or this is wrong. And not does it work or can I get something out of it. They legitimately think in terms of this is right and that's wrong, which is really great. But here's the downside. Not everything is so clearly cut into those two categories. And yet the millennial crowd just seems driven to put every controversy, discussion, debate topic, point, data point, piece of information, conversation into the category of this is morally right or that's morally wrong. So, some students didn't want to advocate for this bill, which is fine. I mean, you certainly have the right not to, but on the basis or the premise that they think it's going to do damage. But what's the research for that? Where's the background for that? What about all the good things it will do when it comes down to, and here's really the problem, is that, overusing the categories more right, more wrong, ends up simplifying very complex things. So this bill, which it's going to help a lot of people. It's going to allow local governments in small third world countries to get resources to help education. And yeah, there's consequences are going to go wrong, right? You're going to end up giving the wrong people the wrong resources, or there's all kinds of things that go wrong. But the grand scale of things, practically, there's a lot of good that come out of it. So it really, and this is what got me, is that it took all of this tremendous complexity, and it boiled it down to this really clear, polar, digital, if you will, way of thinking. This is morally right, and that's morally wrong. And I see this now in a lot. I mean, I've been thinking about this for a while, but I see it in a lot of millennial thinking. They can't get their minds around the fact that things might be more complex than they get. Now, I grew up in a white, blue-collar home, and I was around mechanics and machines, and life was always complicated, and you always had to figure it out. So I see process, and I see difficulty, and I see complexity. I don't say nuance. That's too self-glorifying. I don't mean that, but you just see complexity. Getting anything done takes a tremendous amount, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And so you could have a really morally great idea that can, i.e., one, have really bad consequences. You can say, I'm going to do this as morally right. That moral right thing can have bad consequences. Or you can, not account for simply all the things involved. There's a lot that goes into overcoming barriers and obstacles, let's say, in third world education, and whether or not the American fingerprint will be on it, or American dollars will be too involved, or American companies might make a profit. Those things have to come up, but they can't be the only part of the conversation. I remember someone in the Obama administration, when the health care bill was being passed, and one of the arguments that was raised was, will it work? And the response was, it doesn't matter, it's the right thing to do. And I think right there lies a very tricky tension. You want to do what's morally right, but whether it works or not is also an important question to ask. You might set out to do something that sounds morally perfect. I want to make sure more kids eat food. The ethanol is a perfect example. Raising or requiring fuel companies to include ethanol. Why? Because we want to reduce particulates in the atmosphere. We want to reduce pollution, that kind of thing. Great, except there's these complicated unintended consequences. The price of corn goes skyrocket high because now corn is being sold to ethanol plants. I'm not saying it wasn't worthwhile. What I'm saying is, and that's up to you, but what I'm saying is that just because you set out to do something good doesn't mean what you're doing is going to do good. Right? I mean, just because you set out to do good doesn't mean what you're setting out to do actually does good. And that's far harder. You have to be self-reflective, self-critical. I want to do this. I want to make sure this is done right. Ooh, will it work? What are the unintended consequences? What else could transpire if I do this? Am I missing something? And you don't want to be frozen by uncertainty. But I think the opposite is more dangerous. You don't want to be driven by certainty. I just think you'd be very cautious. Whatever you set out to do that's very complicated, if you are driven by certainty, you will overlook certain complexities. You will ignore certain information. You will simply not see things that need to be seen. I'll give you a quote from George Will, and I'll end it on that. George Will said years ago in an article, I don't remember exactly where it is, but he said, and it's my favorite quote, so if you know me, you've heard this before, but the quote goes something like this: for every problem that is complex, there is an answer that is simple and clear and wrong. And one thing that moralizing does, when you moralize an issue, is that you take all the complexities and you boil them down into a digital response. Yes, good, no, evil. And I think sometimes we have to do that for sure, but there seems to be a race to moralize every political topic that we talk about. So we don't ask whether or not, and I'm not saying again that these aren't good things. Welfare programs have done a lot of good. And I think you can moralize the opposite way. If it's government involvement, then it's evil. Or the opposite side, if there's government involvement, it's good. I think there are some moral things that happen there, but at the same time, you have to calculate what are the unintended consequences. And can we set aside the moral question for a moment, not permanently, but for a moment, where all of our certainties lie, and for a minute deal with the complexity of, does it actually work? Are there other things to be considered? Does it have other consequences we didn't like, we unintended? Rather than, as soon as we hear everything, just dropping it into one of two moral bags. And one then becomes evil and everything in it is awful, and the other side is just good and wonderful. Again, what I heard today, it just seems like the millennial tendency is a oversimplification of issues into moral categories. That's food for thought.